Okay, good evening to everyone and welcome to our biannual series of public lectures of the project Twisted Transfers, Discursive Constructions of Corruption in Ancient Greece and Rome. This is a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and by the German Research Foundation, the DFG. And even if our project focuses primarily on classical antiquity, it is heavily informed by comparative historical research and social sciences. In this regard, this lecture series aims to encourage cross-disciplinary approaches and dialogues that are at the core of our project. It is for me a great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Professor Elizabeth David-Barrett. She's the director of the prestigious Cross-Disciplinary Center for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex, and an international expert in public policy, corruption, and public responses to corruption. Previously, she worked at the Saïd Business School and at the Department of Sociology at the University of Oxford. She holds a DPhil, so a doctorate in politics from Oxford, an MA in Slavonic and East European Studies from the University of London, as well as a BA in Philosophy, Politics and Economics, also from Oxford. Professor David-Barrett has collaborated with think tanks such as the London Public Policy Research and the Centre for European Reform, and worked as journalist in Croatia, in Hungary, for media such as The Economist, the Financial Times, the BBC World Service, and Business Central Europe. She works and has worked with numerous international anti-corruption private and public institutions, including the governments of Jamaica and Uganda, NGOs, social activists, and organizations such as Transparency International and the Task Force on the transatlantic response to illicit finance. She has also advised the UK Department for International Development on its international anti-corruption programme and the UK Cabinet Office on the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. The breadth, depth, and impact of Professor David-Barrett's individual and collaborative research and publications is impressive. An example is the very innovative Curing Corruption in Procurement project funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office since 2016, which explores how big data analytics can be used to identify and reduce corruption risks in public procurement. This work has been used by the World Bank and by governments, Jamaica and from Uganda, for instance. I would like also to highlight Professor David-Barrett's groundbreaking experimental research on norm diffusion, from hard laws, such as the anti-bribery law, to soft laws, like, for instance, self-regulating norms and codes such as business clubs, informed by club theory. She has also extensively worked on parliamentary codes of conduct, including conflicts of interest, the practice of the revolving door and lobbying. And she's a specialized advisor of the UK House of Commons and of various Southeastern European parliaments, and a recurring guest as well at BBC Two Newsnight. Rethinking State Capture and its impact on inequality, the lecture today will discuss the risks, mechanisms, and impact of state capture, a type of systematic corruption, she will explain that better, by which narrow interest groups take control of institutions and the process of public policy making. Corruption is, of course, a problem that affects all societies, past and present, and we, as a project, but also as citizens, believe that the better we understand how it works and also how it originates, also from different angles, fields, and research approaches, the better we can prevent it and fight it. The audience tonight is very diverse, including historians from different periods. So I anticipate that the discussion will be also in different directions, going in different directions. So let me just, at the end, so just reminded that we are recording the session and that this video will be accessible from our website soon. And please feel free at the end of the lecture to ask your questions, either by raising your hand or by writing your questions on the forum. And finally, Liz, many, many thanks for accepting our invitation of the Twisted Transfer Project to talk tonight about your exciting work. We're looking forward to learning about the complexities of state capture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta, for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm actually really delighted to be here and to be able to discuss with all of you who are doing such an interesting project. So I'm going to try now to share my screen. Hopefully that will work smoothly. And so, as Marta said, I'm going to be talking about rethinking the concept of state capture and also thinking about its impact on inequality. First of all, I'm going to explain why I think it's important to talk about state capture again with a very brief history of the concept. I'm aware suddenly that I'm in a room of historians, and probably my idea of a brief history is incredibly brief because I'm actually only going back 25 years or so. But in any case, I just wanted to situate it in terms of how this concept has developed. Then we'll look at what's special about state capture. So what are the mechanisms that are used? What are the intentions of actors who are engaging in state capture? We'll discuss a few case studies. Those are contemporary case studies from different parts of the world. I'll then make some suggestions about how state capture relates to inequality. And then finally, we have a brief look at how we might prevent capture. And this is very much a political economy approach. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and how this looks to you as scholars of ancient civilizations in terms of whether there is something useful and new and about this concept. So the concept in the sort of last few decades of social science really emerged when looking at the transition in parts of the former Soviet Union and Central and Eastern Europe. So it's a term that is coined by Hellman, Jones and Kaufman in 2000. And they are studying that transition. Of course, it's at the same time both a political and an economic transition from a communist system to a capitalist system, and from an authoritarian system to a democratizing and democratic system. And they identify the concept of state capture as a kind of improper influence, particularly over the formation of laws and policy. So they contrast it with administrative corruption, which they see also as improper influence, but improper influence over how laws and policy are implemented, not over how they're formed. So this is something that's happening at a very early stage of the policy-making process. And they are observing this happening, particularly, for example, in Russia, where this seems to be a process that is driven by a few business interests who quickly become known as the oligarchs. And it's the oligarchs who are really using their economic power to capture the state. So they are capturing this process of forming laws and policy so that those laws and policy are then formed in ways that suit them and their business interests. So that original concept of state capture downplayed in a way the role of political leaders. So it was very much about these business interests coming in and capturing state processes and capturing that formation of law. But actually, I think, even at that stage, the political leaders were quite key. They weren't emphasized enough. And we have other scholars in the social sciences, such as Janine Wedel, who had identified a practice of institutional nomadism. And she said that there are actually some actors who are kind of surfing between public and private rules. They're sometimes, operating in the private sector, but actually very closely connected with the public sector. And they're switching between which rule systems apply to which different sector to try to maximize their private benefits. So in a way, they're doing a kind of a regulatory arbitrage. They're choosing whether they're situated in the public or the private sector and choosing the rules that apply to them in accordance with where they're situated. So we already have this sense that actually there are these people who are using these barriers between public and private sector to their own advantage. We also saw in some other countries in Central and Eastern Europe the emergence of something quite similar to the oligarchs, so the emergence of what were tended to be called tycoons in other countries. So in Slovakia, for example, under Mečiar, in Croatia under Tudjman. And these tycoons often had very close links to the political leaders, which tended to be having a kind of nationalist ideology. And they often benefited very much, again, from the privatization program. So they were able to get advantageous access to assets that were being privatized through their close links to the political leaders. So what about 20 years on then? Where are we now in thinking about state capture? Well, I think that the concept has really come back on the agenda of scholars, in particular because of what's been happening in South Africa. So that first picture up there shows Jacob Zuma, the former president of South Africa, with the Gupta brothers. And this was actually more along the lines of that sort of traditional kind of capture, in that the Gupta brothers were business people, but they formed very close links with Zuma, and I'll tell you more about it later. But their close links and close relationship were identified as a form of state capture, and in fact, South Africa is now having an inquiry into state capture after Zuma's rule. But it's also something that we've seen elsewhere, I think. So then we've got Viktor Orban down there in the left in Hungary, abusing his power in many ways to capture the state. We've got Erdogan in Turkey. We have Isabel dos Santos in Angola, Vučić in Serbia, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and the Rajapaksas in Sri Lanka. And in all of these cases, we seem to see similar kinds of patterns in terms of this narrow interest groups capturing the state. But actually, in most of these cases, it seems to be led more by the political leaders, and they're creating advantages for themselves and consolidating their own power, rather than it necessarily being led by the business side. So we've got a number of terms that we see floating around to describe these kinds of behavior. We often see the term kleptocrats. There's a lot of recent excellent books out around kleptocracy, so focusing on these political leaders abusing their power to steal money from their countries. We see, particularly in Europe, a lot of talk about democratic backsliding. So this is a concept that's often been applied to describe Hungary and Poland and some of the countries in the Western Balkans, saying that actually, instead of being on a kind of inexorable process towards more democracy, they seem to have taken a number of steps back. And so then we also have the concept of state capture, and I'm going to argue that it does, I think, add some value, but it's, again, one of these terms that is used to describe the kinds of practices that we're seeing increasingly in so many different parts of the world. So this modern state capture, I think, is quite complicated. It's not so very clearly a few business interests capturing the state. It's also not very clearly political leaders trying to abuse their power and using business in that. So in fact, you see a lot of blurring and a lot of codependency between particular government groups and particular business groups. So, for example, you'll have political leaders who are in government, but of course they're part of a party. They're also often in government able to control parliament quite well if they've got a big majority. So they've got quite good control over all of those institutions. And so what you might see is that you've got some private businesses who are giving donations to a political party, but that is influencing government decisions, perhaps influencing governments in terms of the laws that they're pushing through parliaments. So they're influencing that formation of policy in that way. But we're also seeing government make a lot of politicized appointments to state-owned enterprises, which are then also potentially giving out contracts to other private businesses. And we're seeing a kind of machine politics where contracts are given out through the public procurement system in exchange for either donations to parties from private businesses, or sometimes kind of benefits in kind. So if you've got a big media company that's receiving a lot of contracts from the government, they might provide a kind of kickback to the government in terms of their support for the regime by running coverage about how, by running favourable coverage about the regime. Now, I think all of this is exacerbated by the fact that the public-private boundary is much more blurred than it used to be, certainly 30 or 40 years ago. So we've seen, particularly in Western Europe and North America, but also spreading out to pretty much every region of the world, an increase in the practice of outsourcing the provision of public services. So rather than providing public services themselves, governments give out contracts to private companies that then provide the public services on their behalf. So that creates a number of blurred boundaries between public and private, creates incentives for that movement through the revolving door, for example. There's also not necessarily one captor, so I think it becomes even more difficult to identify a particular captor group. You might have capture driven by some actors that are inside the state, some politicians and some civil servants, but you might equally have it driven by some private sector actors. And there definitely seems to be this codependent relationship between the two. But I still think that state capture is adding value as a concept, and that's for three reasons. Firstly, I think it highlights the intentional nature of elite actions to increase their grip on power. And actually, one of the things that I don't like so much about the term democratic backsliding is that it almost implies that that move away from democracy is by accident, so sliding away, when in fact, actually, there are some really concrete and intentional and deliberate moves by those in power to try to consolidate their grip on power and close down any checks on that power. So it's quite intentional, I think. The concept also allows us to focus on the mechanisms through which this capture occurs. So we're, I think, encouraged by this term to look at, oh, okay, what exactly is being captured and how? And it also reveals the importance of independent institutions in building resilience against capture. So sort of embedded in the concept in a way is some suggestion about how we can avoid capture. Okay, so looking at this from the perspective of an elite group that wants to capture the state, how do you go about it? So I suggest that there are three pillars or channels of influence that you really want to capture and that we see being captured in examples of modern state capture. So firstly, you want to do that traditional part, in fact, that Jones and Hellman and Kaufman identified. You want to shape the formation of laws and policy. And just as they identified, this is a really good way of changing the rules of the game such that you and your narrow interest group are favoured and privileged into the long term. So it's a kind of capture that has really long-term consequences. Secondly, though, we see modern captors of the state trying to control the implementation phase of policy too. So they often do this through appointing people into key implementing roles so that they can have influence over the implementation. And thirdly, we see them also trying to disable the accountability institutions. So any checks or balances on their power, they try to disable and undermine so that they are better able to consolidate power in the first two spheres. So let's look in a little bit more detail then at what the mechanisms and targets of capture are. So I'm going to start with the shaping of the laws and policy. So key things that you want to do if you're a captor trying to capture the state: change the constitution. This is absolutely the rules of the game in a modern state. So changing the constitution is a good way of consolidating your power. You might also try to change the election system. Potentially you even do this to help you get into power if you've got some influence over those who are already in power, but you certainly might want to change the electoral system so that you can more easily stay in power and not be challenged. Also, key state functions are of course, around controlling the means of physical violence and force over the territory. So being able to control the military and the police is really important. Other strategic assets include strategic economic assets. So perhaps it's particularly important for you to control utilities, for example, or natural resources that tend to be very lucrative. So people will try to get control over those. And of course, the legislature. So down to that process of making laws, trying to control the legislature, prevent it from exercising much scrutiny over your legislative agenda through using a majority or potentially a 2/3 majority. Secondly, there's the control over the implementers. So this could be around how budgets are allocated. So making decisions about which ministry gets more money can be a key way of engaging in state capture, because if you can send most of the money to a particular ministry that you also happen to control, then that's an easy way of getting money out of the state. Appointments then to those state-owned enterprises, which are also going to be distributing state assets, to any big ministries, particularly the big spending ministries, to other state agencies that are involved in public procurement. So anyone who's involved in giving out contracts and giving out money, if you want to capture the state, you really need to control those so that you can be able to give out those contracts to your allies and cronies. And also potentially regulatory decisions. So another important part of implementation is decisions about how regulation is in fact interpreted. So controlling those regulators can also be really important. And then finally, disabling the accountability institutions. So this is likely to include key institutions in a democracy like the judiciary. So the independence of the judiciary is a key check and balance on the executive's power. So we see moves to reduce the independence of the judiciary, increase politicized appointments, perhaps undermine the judiciary's resources and autonomy in various ways. Again, seeking to influence law enforcement and prosecution. You can completely undermine law enforcement agencies by cutting their budgets. You can put in your own ally as the prosecutor general as a way of ensuring that your own people are not prosecuted. But then also those institutions like the Supreme Audit Institution, which have a key role in scrutinizing how policy is implemented. If you control the audit institution by putting in your own person as the head of it, or again by cutting its budget, then you can disable some of that potential check on power. And finally, clampdowns on more traditional civil society areas. So we've seen a big clampdown on civil society space in many countries around the world in recent years, making it more difficult for civil society organizations to operate, to access funding, to have autonomy. We've seen clampdown on the media, and also in some countries a clampdown on academic freedom and independence. So all of those potential sources that could be raising the alarm about abuse of executive power, we see them being squashed in various ways. So I wanted to talk about a few cases now. So one that is quite close to my heart because I used to live there, but also where I think we've almost seen a sort of forerunner of this whole state capture process in Europe is Hungary under Viktor Orban since 2010. So when Orban was elected, and he was democratically elected, he got a 2/3 majority in parliament, and he was able to use that majority to change the constitution. He changed it in quite radical ways. He restricted the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, and he's then done a number of other things which have consolidated his power and made it much more difficult to challenge him. We've also seen that he's influenced procurement to channel contracts to allies. Many Orban cronies have become extremely rich, won many state contracts, and so we see clear evidence of favoritism in the procurement process there in quite systematic ways. And then he's done a number of things to reduce the checks and balances, so changed the way that judges are appointed, which meant that a lot of judges were retired and new people could be appointed. So he was able to put in his own political allies, also changed things around how cases are allocated to certain judges. So again, giving a lot of greater control over who reviews which cases. He's appointed cronies to the prosecutor's office, the audit institution, the media regulator. So again, undermining their autonomy, and has redrawn the electoral boundaries so that it's easier for his party to do well in the elections. So in some ways, a lot of what we've seen in the last 10 years was really started by Orban. But I mentioned another big case, which is the Zuma-Gupta alliance in South Africa. So Zuma allowed the Guptas to influence government appointments, even to the cabinet, but also to key state-owned enterprises and agencies. Those agencies and state-owned enterprises then awarded large state contracts to the Guptas. So there was a classic kind of machine politics working there. The Guptas in return provided protection and support to Zuma. Partly that was through positive coverage from their television channel, but also in other ways. And also, I just wanted to highlight here that there was a sort of manipulation of the Black economic empowerment agenda in transition South Africa to favour allies. So often they would say that they were favouring certain people because of those commitments under Black economic empowerment, whereas I would argue that often it was really a cover for wanting to favour particular allies for more corrupt reasons. Brazil is a very interesting case. Although we talk about Bolsonaro at the moment as a potential example of state capture, in fact, here what I wanted to talk about is the previous regimes. And what we've seen is there's been a major revelations around the Odebrecht scandal. So this was a construction company which was highly involved in machine politics in Brazil, but also in other countries in South America. And so what happened in Brazil is that the presidency relied very much on having legislative support from a coalition of political parties known as Central. And in fact, the president allowed this coalition to control many of these appointments, again, to key ministries, to state-owned enterprises, other state agencies. Again, just like with the Guptas, those state bodies then gave out state contracts, often very overpriced state contracts, to this construction company, Odebrecht. And Odebrecht in turn paid kickbacks to the politicians and the civil servants. So again, this classic kind of case of machine politics. The state power is abused to give out state resources in the form of contracts to a company, and the company incentivizes this with kickbacks to the politicians and civil servants. We have a lot of information about this because the case was revealed, and so it's really allowed us to document this in quite a lot of detail. A more recent one, Sri Lanka, we've seen the Rajapaksa family elected into power again in late 2019. The president then elected 3 of his brothers appointed 3 of his brothers and his nephew into key ministerial roles, such that the one family directly controls now through these roles at least 24% of the state budget. So a really interesting example of capture by family, in fact, in this case. They've also appointed key allies to state-owned enterprises and to other key government jobs, particularly in the COVID era, some of those key jobs around how COVID was being handled. They've done other classic moves, like they've removed the constitutional status of the Anti-Corruption Agency and taken away its power to initiate investigations. So clearly that benefits them if they are engaging in corruption. They've also abolished the National Procurement Commission, which had a regulatory role over procurement, and the Audit Service Commission. So all of these bodies that would have potentially checked on state capture type behaviour, they've abolished or undermined in some way. They've also really clamped down on the civil society space. They've arrested and detained several journalists and activists, and they have quite close links with some key media, which again suggests that they're able to manipulate the media, or at least rely on getting quite favourable coverage from some key media outlets. So a question that's come up much more for me in the last couple of years is whether the UK state is being captured or is an example of state capture. And I think the case for this is becoming stronger, to be honest. So that if we look at those 3 spheres, we can see in that first channel or pillar of state capture, there is a practice of rushing major laws through Parliament without proper scrutiny, and very heavy reliance on statutory instruments. So the initial law that is passed is missing a lot of detail, often leaving a lot of discretion for fleshing out that detail in secondary regulation later. So that's poor practice because it doesn't allow for proper parliamentary scrutiny. One example of this just a couple of weeks ago in the new police and crime bill, we saw that the Home Office put in a further 18 pages of draft law right at the last minute without that being able to be subject to proper scrutiny. So those kinds of practices are not good democratic practice. Secondly, we have seen quite a lot of the administration appointing political allies to key roles in state agencies, to particular regulators and to the House of Lords. Now, with the House of Lords in particular, some investigative journalists have uncovered that it seems that these appointments to the House of Lords are being made in exchange for donations in many cases. So there was an Open Democracy and Sunday Times investigation that found that former treasurers of the Conservative Party do seem to get peerages, particularly if they've given £3 million or more to the Conservative Party. So that looks like a sort of buying peerages. We've also seen sort of stuffing political allies into key regulators, or at least trying to put people into those positions. So there's been quite a controversy over the appointment to the media regulator, Ofcom, where they put forward a candidate who was rejected as unsuitable, and they then sought to change the rules and put him forward again. In fact, that hasn't happened, but again, it was an unusual practice to try and put that political ally into a key regulatory position. And we've also seen major attacks on accountability institutions, particularly the judiciary. There's a big reform of the judicial review process. There's a new initiative to say that some decisions of the courts could be overturned by ministers if the ministers think that those decisions are wrong. So quite an attack there on the judiciary. Also, of course, with the review of the decision to prorogue Parliament during the Brexit negotiations, again, quite strong attacks on the judiciary there. And we've seen attacks on the BBC, on Channel 4, and I think just practices of not really wanting to put ministers up for scrutiny in the media. So I think my conclusion is that it's not a captured state yet, but there are some quite worrying moves in the direction of state capture. And I think really important to keep vigilant and keep that civil society space open to avoid slipping further into that. So I've suggested that there are these three different areas of influence if you want to capture the state. And I further would like to suggest that these are not necessarily things that you need to do in a particular sequence. So the pillars could be seen as Lego blocks in a way. And in fact, what you might find is that in a more democratic system, it's more important to engage in pillar 3 first, because you need to disable the accountability institutions before you can do so much of the influencing the implementers and shaping the formation of laws. In less advanced democracies, you might see people going straight into pillar 1 and 2 and worrying less about pillar 3. But it seems to me that these different elements from the pillars don't necessarily need to be sequenced in a particular way. But that's perhaps a research question, actually, to try and explore that. So I was thinking about how to prevent capture, and so I've just come up with a very simplified version of what capture is. And so I'd like to suggest that in the left-hand picture, we've got a kind of healthy, functioning democratic system which is not captured. And so you've got P's, politicians and public officials. You've got B's, business people, and they're separate. They engage with each other, of course, and it is very important in a democratic system to have business being able to lobby politicians and public officials and say, for example, this new law that you're thinking of introducing will have a very negative impact on our sector, being able to explain that. So having a relationship and links between politicians and business people is fine. But all those A's are the accountability institutions, and they're able to oversee what's going on, oversee those relationships, and get in the way of them to some extent. So to try and keep a separation between politics and business. If you look at the picture on the right, I think this is where you've got a captured state. And what's happened here is that the politicians and public officials and the business people have in fact become so blurred and mixed up that you've got a new class emerging, and these are the kleptocrats, the Ks. And in this system, they are actually very powerful, and they've managed to make the accountability institutions less influential and push them to the edge where they're no longer able to exercise very strong oversight over the system. So this is really just a way of saying that if we want to prevent capture, there are two principles to think about. One, I think, is about keeping politics and business separate, and maybe not just so much separate, but balanced to some extent in terms of how much power they have. And secondly, we need to protect the space, the independence, and the resources of oversight institutions so that they can continue to function and keep the politicians and business relationships clean. Okay, so what about inequality? So I think the overall theoretical basis for thinking that state capture would increase inequality is as follows. Firstly, if narrow interest groups are shaping law making and policy implementation, they're going to do that in ways that benefit themselves. And so that means probably that those who are already occupying quite powerful positions are going to benefit more from the way that they shape the laws and the policy. So they're going to increase their power and their control. And state capture then also neutralizes institutions and organizations that are intended to be checks on that power and that are intended to act as a voice for less powerful groups or for the public interest. So those organizations are also getting weaker as a result of state capture. So it seems to me that we're quite likely going to then get a kind of vicious circle of inequality becoming worse and worse because the few powerful and wealthier individuals and actors and organizations are going to have much more scope to influence the rules of the game, whereas the weaker voices are going to become weaker and weaker. And then I wanted to look at 3 ways in which this inequality then would be exacerbated by state capture. So delving into how it changes the balance of power. One aspect is around national and individual security. So where we have captors who are abusing the military and the police to keep that narrow interest group in power, then they're ceasing to protect society as a whole, or the military and the police are ceasing to protect society as a whole. And usually minority groups in particular are likely to suffer there. So they become less secure in their position. In terms of economic power, the allocation of state assets to narrow groups exacerbates that already unequal distribution of economic power. And you're going to get economic development becoming skewed towards sectors that the elite can control and reducing opportunities for companies in other sectors. So a classic example of this would be natural resources governance, where you tend to get the natural resource curse, where the economy becomes very skewed towards natural resources for a number of reasons, but one of them can be state capture. And then also political power. So in state capture, the opposition groups find it difficult to operate, difficult to raise money and challenge the government. And so state capture is also undermining political competition and again entrenching that elite in power and making it very difficult for anyone to challenge them. So that's also likely to lead to inequality, with opposition groups and the people that they represent not being represented in government. Secondly, then looking particularly at this economic development. So one thing that is usually part of state capture is this abuse of the public procurement process. So suppliers with the right connections are favoured, and those that lack links to the captor network fail to win contracts. So over time, what that means is that, in fact, the economy will become skewed. Companies that don't have good connections won't win any public procurement contracts. And particularly where the state is large, that means they just won't succeed. So those companies will start to fail. You'll then have even less competition for the captor companies, and they'll have less incentive to actually provide a good quality service. The abuse of patronage power means that the appointed clients will start to make and implement policy in ways that benefit themselves and their patrons to the detriment of others. And we'll see that state services and support will be distributed mainly to narrow interest groups. So the already disadvantaged ethnic, religious, or indigenous groups will become poorer and worse off. And actually Hellman, so that one of those first scholars looking at state capture, suggests that the effect of capture on economic development might depend partly on sequencing. So he argues that where you've kind of got a political marketplace with a lot of competition before universal suffrage is introduced, then you might get less harmful types of corruption than in countries where the mass voting rights are only introduced when political competition is more fragmented and more chaotic. So again, some interesting research questions there, I think, that could be explored more. So thirdly, then, focusing in on the rights of minorities, state capture undermines the rule of law. Judicial institutions start to be used as political weapons, leaving ordinary people with little access to justice or redress. So that's likely to hit underrepresented minorities particularly hard. By reducing the ability of the accountability institutions to do their job, to reveal irregularities and seek improvements, probably you'll get declining performance of public administration and worse public services over time, because there's no accountability to try and keep them on track or improve them. And you'll get crackdowns on university autonomy that undermine critical thinking and higher education. And over time, that's going to lead to a less skilled workforce, a lack of investment in key disciplines, and a lack of intellectual growth and innovation. People won't be willing to take risks because of their lack of autonomy. Then looking a bit longer term, I want to suggest that there are three other big important impacts on society. So one is brain drain. In countries where there is capture of the state, you're undermining the principle that an individual can improve their social standing through merit, hard work, talent. Instead, what happens in captured states is that resources are distributed according to political alliances, maybe sometimes tribal, kin, ethnic alliances. And that means that there's little space for individuals to improve their standing through hard work or studying. And what that then means is that the most intelligent and able individuals will instead leave the country if they can, because their chances of advancement will be better in a different situation where it's more meritocratic. And in fact, there's some research by Alina Manju-Pipidi on this, suggesting that this is already the case, particularly in the Western Balkans, that people who are, in fact, probably the cleverest, brainiest people are more likely to leave because they have better chances abroad. Secondly, stratification. State capture intensifies stratification in societies because the capture groups give advantages to clearly defined groups of allies. Now, again, they might be identified according to kin, tribe, ethnicity, regional identity, some other kind of ideological background. But that's going to reduce social mobility in the society because those identities are largely things that are externally imposed and difficult to change. So you will get societies becoming more polarized because they effectively can't trust the state to provide for them. And you'll probably get individuals becoming more reliant on their social networks as a coping strategy. And you'll also get a more delineated elite, I think, a slightly different point where the elite will become more separate from the public. In fact, the lived experience of the elite is going to become entirely different to that of ordinary people. The way that they achieve things and get things done is likely to be through these cronyist networks, and they'll become increasingly out of touch and unable then to anticipate the impact of public policies. So even if they wanted to work in the public interest, they're probably going to be less in touch with what that would mean. So finally, then, I just wanted to pose a question around how we deal with the situation if we have managed to stop state capture. And again, I think South Africa is a really interesting example here because they have called a halt to this process of state capture, and that's pretty remarkable. They have also had a huge commission of inquiry into state capture, so calling hundreds of witnesses to tell them about how state capture happened and worked, and building up a really solid evidence base, which could mean that there's a really good basis for reform and for thinking about how to prevent state capture happening again and avoid it. But at the same time, it's really difficult to reverse this process once you've done it. So I know that a lot of people in Hungary are also looking ahead to the elections next April and thinking, so if the opposition wins, what do they do, actually? How do you start rolling back this kind of capture of the state and the huge consolidation of power? And in particular, how do you deal with something like the fact that political cronies have been appointed into key institutions? If you go and get rid of them and put in people you trust, then aren't you just doing the same thing? And you get into a kind of dynamic of it's our turn to eat, where whoever's in power is actually abusing their power to steal resources and not actually building up institutions that serve the whole of the public interest. And of course, even in South Africa, although there's this whole process going on, there's also a lot of pressure politically to resolve issues of major unemployment and economic weakness. So the kinds of reforms that you might need to do to build the institutions and make them resilient to state capture are probably reforms that are going to take a long time. They're not necessarily going to deliver lots of jobs quickly. It's much more about a longer term building up of the state and distributing power to different groups over the longer term. So I think there's some really difficult challenges for political scientists, for people in public policy, people going into politics, around how you deal with state capture after the event and how you build something better after a situation of state capture. So thank you very much. I look forward very much to your questions.